Hello. Okay, so in this session, I want to look at BSL, British Sign Language, and what it is. Now, for deaf people, it's the main way they communicate. They use British Sign Language. So I'm going to look specifically at what BSL is because there are other forms of communication using sign. There's SSE, there's Sign Supported English, and there are oral approaches to using communication with sign. Now, first of all, I want to think about the use of BSL. So I grew up using BSL. My parents were deaf. I had a brother who was deaf. So the whole family on a daily basis use sign language. Now, this wasn't the case when I was in school. It was an oral school. So I really struggled because I was forced to lip read and I just struggled. I had to use the written form of communication as well. And now sign language would have really helped me in my education, but the teachers said it was a must that we used or an oral approach to education. I had to lip read. Now, I want to provide a bit of context, a historical context. So before the 1880s, there were a lot of accomplished deaf people who were poets and were very literate, and a lot of them were very manual, in their ability to create things, but they could gain understanding through the use of sign language. Now, the problem we had before the 1880s, there was a particular individual who was German. Now, their belief was that education should be provided through an oralist approach. But this was a contradiction to a French individual who believed in using sign language to educate people. Now, this came to a head in Milan. There was a world congress where people were brought together to discuss this issue. Now, there were many teachers, qualified teachers of the deaf, who were deaf, but they weren't allowed to come to this conference. They were all hearing. Now, there was one person who was let in who was deaf, but they struggled. And at the end of this conference, there was a vote, oralism versus the use of sign. And the vote favoured oralism. Now, that meant that sign language ended up being banned in education right throughout the world. So, what you need to remember, though, is this wasn't a legal standing. There was no legal standing around this at all. There was no constitutional thing protecting this decision. It was just the teachers themselves making a decision about how things were going to be. And this is an abuse of deaf people's rights, going back to this event. After the 1880s, we saw the decline of deaf education because there was no use of sign language. Children would have struggled trying to access things through lip reading. And this is how that came about. So in the 1970s, 1980s, we saw the re-emergence of sign language. We saw people rediscovering their rights, and we saw a real rise of education when it came to people's needs. And that's why, when we think about sign language, it's so crucial because this is about people's understanding, their logical development, how things work, and they access that through sign language. And you can use speech, you can think about how that might feature and build a relationship between that and what people are learning through sign language. But without that, deaf people suffer. Now, for me, BSL has been so valuable. It's helped me gain an education. It's helped me get on in life. I went to college, I went to university, I achieved an MA, all these qualifications. But this was through the use of sign language, through the use of interpreters who use sign language. Now, that's why BSL is so valuable to that of deaf people. And I will talk more about that. I will talk about the different needs that deaf people have around that. And I'll address that in my next session. But for now, thank you and farewell.